Dr. Matta, you're with the World Bank, and you're going to have to, I guess, respond to some of these points that have been put forward. The World Bank did advocate for the subsidy removal. Dr. Abdu read back to the SAPO deal, that was kind of the IMF, but still. So, look, I guess if you wish to respond to some of those points from your perspective, the why this was necessary.
Yeah, thanks so much, and thanks for the invitation. Let me put it, I would say, two numbers, which I think one of them the GEP mentioned. So net reserves was $700 million, and I remember, or $800 million in 2023. And I remember we were at some point in a conference in the central bank, and I was making the point that Nigeria was on the brink of collapsing. And I remember the governor corrected me, Nigeria was in the collapse. So that's the first number. The second number, debt service revenues. And here I'm talking because I think in Nigeria, when people talk about government, people tend to refer to the federal government. I'm talking with the entire federation. Debt service revenues in 2022, it was 102%, meaning that for every 1 naira collected, you need to borrow to pay it back. So in a way, I think there's a lot of analogies on, on hospitals and the health sector. So I think at that time, Nigeria was, if kind of take that analogy, you have a patient who was in full cancer. So we're trying to give him chemotherapy, and that will not work, right? And I guess the counterfactual was, if nothing was done, Nigeria could have gone to Sri Lanka. And the case of Sri Lanka is clear. So I remember we had colleagues there. When you don't have don't have reserves, you cannot import, right? And in Q1 2023, so you had the famous Naira redesign, you had the elections, and you had the subsidies. I remember there was a journal article, and I will not forget it. So Nigeria had 3 queues. So I had the queues for petrol, so I had the queues to get cash, and then a queue to get the ID cards for the. So I think that it was a really bad situation. Now, I think we can all agree or, discuss whether the sequencing was right, whether, it was gradual or not. I'm in the view personally, I don't think it would have been gradual, because when you're in a cancer, if you give, 2 doses of medicine, it will not help. You really need to do shock therapy. And I think that was needed. And I think the question is whether it was sequenced or not, we can discuss, because effectively, as it was mentioned, the big reforms were done in 2024. So I think the time between mid-2023 and when the reforms were done, what could argue that whether, back then the monetary policy could have been faster to react? Yes. One could have argued that why the subsidy lasted for another few months? Yes. But I think we all agree that that should have been done. I'm personally, I don't think a gradual approach would have worked. I think what could have potentially, and I agree, I think maybe when these decisions were made, ideally, and again, that's in an ideal scenario, you would need to have the social protection already in place. So when these policies are done, the cash goes directly to people rather than wait a few months. And I think that's something that I guess needs to be, I would say, improved upon in the future. Now, I guess in that context, and I think there's a context of also whether these policies have contributed to poverty or not. I guess I will put it back to the counterfactual. So first is the PMS subsidy. All the empirical evidence was saying that the PMS subsidy was going to the rich, not the poor, right? So the poor don't have, they don't have cars to finance, to get petrol. So it was basically going to the rich people who have the big SUVs, who have big electricity at their home, etc. So I guess the second point I want to make is, as a country now, right? So, and obviously it's not for the bank to say anything, right? It's a choice. I think the question is how to kind of make sure that inflation goes down, because, and I agree with the GEP, is that the biggest now tax on the poor is to kind of get that inflation down. And I hear a lot of the narrative is that, okay, inflation is now to 15%, so we should celebrate. I agree it's good to get it down to 15%, but that's still double digit. And, double digit inflation means your poverty will it could potentially decline because it's on a high base, but it could decline very slowly. And I think that's the challenge. So I think the first challenge kind of going forward is how to make sure that inflation continues to go down and hopefully it reaches single digit. I think that should be really good. And at the same time, to kind of change, I would say, or accelerate that growth. 4% is good compared to the historical, but if you look at it per capita, with a population of 2.5% growth, it's still, I mean, it's I would say moderate, but it needs to go to 5, 6, 7% to have that growth faster. And the composition of that growth, I think, should also evolve towards more jobs, job creating sectors, which are mainly, I would say, agriculture, industry, and to some extent services, but I would say mainly agriculture. This is where, if you want to lift people out of the poverty, that's where it should go. So again, kind of in summary, I think the shocks therapy was needed. Whether it was, I think the sequencing could have been improved. I guess the answer would be, kind of yes, but at the heart of, when the boat is on fire, or sorry, not when the boat is sinking. Okay, so I think the choices there are how to stabilize the situation, and then at some point how to make sure that when you kind of do this shock therapy, which will have, I would say, negative implications, I think this is where I agree that the social protection should have been faster to kind of kick in to mitigate the impact on the poor and vulnerable.
I think what's next is to kind of make sure, I think the North Star would be to kind of reduce poverty, right? So I think I think should be the direction. And now if you go from there, I think there should be two key focus points. So one of them is to keep the fight against inflation, because again, I think that's the main tax on the poor. And the second one is how to get that growth higher. Now, on the second one, on how to get that growth higher, I think I agree with a lot of what's said. And this is where we think there should be two kind of pillars. So the first one is how to get the public sector in Nigeria, or the state, play its role in ensuring the state would finance where the private sector would not come in when it comes to public goods. And here specifically, we're talking about, obviously, security, human capital. And human capital means education, health, and social protection. Now, for that to happen, you need two recipes for it. So one, you need first money, right? And we all know that revenues in Nigeria, I think the good thing, and I guess the untold story, is that revenues have increased a lot. So as a ratio of GDP, they went like, we can agree on the numbers, but they went from like 5 to 10% in a few years. And this is really good, but it's still very low. So I think the first task is to kind of continue to kind of get that revenues higher. And at the same time, and I totally agree, I think there's a discussion on how to kind of spend better. And on that one, I think the work of the fiscal is harder than the work of the central bank, for a simple reason, is that you have one central bank, but practically you have one federal government, 36 states plus FCT, and 778, I think, local governments. So I guess the question how to kind of get all the fiscal entities working together, especially that currently in Nigeria, the states are spending more than the federal government. And I think this is where I guess that discussion should happen, how the states should use these kind of revenue gains. One is to increase their own revenues too, because I think that's important. And two is how to spend it better. So I think that's on I would say, on human capital, which I totally agree. So I think this is the part on the public sector. But at the same time, I think the public sector should also put the policies to enable the private sector to come in, because even if you spend 20, 30% of GDP, the public sector will not be enough. I mean, the huge needs of the private of Nigeria, roads, infrastructure, power, etc. And the public sector cannot go in everywhere. And I think this is where the public sector should enable the policies. And this is mainly kind of on trade. And I think then I should single as one example on power, on access to finance, on digitalization. So kind of some of these sectors which will unlock the private sector to come in, where the public sector, the resources are better used in areas where the private sector cannot come in. So I think this kind of mix, again, it's a big agenda, but I think it's a long-term agenda that if, all the building pieces are put together, I think we kind of see kind of that grows higher, and then hopefully that poverty kind of goes down faster in the future.